Journey to Greatness Character Lessons from the Past is an interactive lesson designed to help you discover how the challenges you might face today, such as fear, prejudice, poverty, not fitting in.
I was born in Talbot County, Maryland, in February of 1818. I never knew my mother, seeing her only 4 or 5 times, and only at night. They told me that, when she came to see me, it was always during the night after a hard day's work, and she would walk the whole way. My mother would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but she was always gone before I woke up. She died when I was 7. I never knew my father, although there were rumors that he was my master. Even though my master punished people frequently and harshly, I was not often whipped by him. Something that caused me more suffering than the whippings was hunger. I had very little food, and it was boiled, coarse cornmeal called mush. They would put the mush into a big trough and put it on the ground just like they were feeding pigs. We had to eat the mush with our hands. Even worse than the hunger, though, was the bitter cold. I had no shoes, no socks, no coat, and no pants. The only thing I wore was a coarse linen shirt that hung down to my knees. I didn't have a bed, and so, on the coldest nights, I would take a corn sack and crawl into it, trying to shiver myself to sleep on the cold, damp dirt floor. I had to look outside of the home for help with learning to read. The plan I developed that finally worked was to make friends with the little white boys I met in the streets and have them teach me bits and pieces of what I needed to know to learn to read. Whenever I was sent on errands, I always brought my book with me. I would complete my errand quickly so I could have time for a quick lesson before returning home. By the time I was 12 years old, the thought of being a slave for life began to make me very sad. Some of the boys sympathized with me and wished that one day I could be free like they were. I knew that, at that time, I was just too young to even think of running away. In the meantime, I decided I would learn to write. I didn't have paper and pencils, so I had to be creative in finding materials with which to write. I would use chalk and write on fences, walls, and pavement. I had a Webster spelling book, and I practiced and practiced the italic writing until I could do it without looking at the book. It took a long time, but I finally did learn to write. By 1834, I was working for William Freeland. Mr. Freeland, my master, only owned 2 slaves besides me. Their names were Henry and John. They were very smart, and while I was there, I encouraged them to learn to read. They were eager to learn, so I agreed to teach them. On Sunday afternoons, I would give them reading lessons at the home of a free colored man, and slaves from neighboring farms would often come and learn too. Everyone knew, though, that they had to keep these lessons a secret.
Later, in 1835, when I was 12 years old, the masters had pretty much figured out that I wasn't cut out for household chores. Instead, they had me working outside, doing work that was usually done by men, such as working in a flax patch. I had to walk through the field with plants that was twice as tall as me and stiff stalks that would scratch my legs as I pulled each plant up by the roots. When I wasn't working in the flax fields, I was shucking corn, weeding the wheat fields, or shoveling manure. Other times, I would lift heavy barrels of flour into carts. I did like this work more than the jobs inside the house. Also around this time, I suffered an injury that would touch me for the rest of my life. I was at a store and I got between an overseer and a slave who was in a disagreement. The overseer was chasing after the slave and had called him out in the store. I tried to protect the slave by blocking the path of the overseer, but just then he threw a heavy lead weight at the slave who was running away, and it hit me in the head instead of the slave. Hurt me pretty bad. Despite being hurt bad, I was sent back to work. And when I couldn't work, I was sent back to my owner. I laid in bed for months getting better. All this time my owner tried to sell me, but he couldn't find no buyers.
So that's the story of where Harriet Tubman was. She had recovered.
In 1825, when I was all of 3 years old, I started to see and go through firsthand the pain and agony of slavery. Even years later, I couldn't get the terrible things that I saw and heard out of my mind, like women being beaten, families, including my own, being separated, and the great sadness that all this caused. My 2 sisters were taken away from us forever. These sounds and those pictures in my mind, they have never left me.
One time, we went to a downtown shoe store. We sat down toward the front of the store, and the clerk came up and politely asked us to move to seats near the rear of the store. When we said we were comfortable where we were, she said we'd need to move to the back. So my father took me and we walked out of the store. I had never seen my dad so angry. Dad told me that day that no matter how long he had to live with things the way they were, he'd never accept it.
When Martin Luther King Jr. was about 8 years old.
Even though my mother and mama had tried to explain why things were the way they were, I wanted more information. When I was 12 years old, I started reading books that taught me more about history of slavery in Africa and here in America. I read books about the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves. I read about people like Harriet Tubman, a former slave woman who helped many slaves escape to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Another incident occurred when I was riding with him one day in the car. My dad accidentally drove past the stop sign. The policeman called him boy, and my father explained to him that he was a man, not a boy. The policeman was surprised at how my father corrected his wording so eloquently, and he quickly wrote the ticket and left.